There's something that's been on my mind for a long time to talk to you about. Actually, in some ways, it's been on my mind for about 15 years. But I don't want to be hasty about things, you know. And I have a little progression of things to talk about. I want to start first with Paul's idea of the earthly and the heavenly. He says, first there was the earthly man, Adam, and we were like him, and then there's the heavenly man, Jesus, the new Adam. And that's the image for which we strive. In this dichotomy between earthly and heavenly, often it seems to me in the church, in the people with whom I, deal most of the time, you guys, yes, there is a matter of good and evil. We struggle with evil to some degree, but I don't find that my parishioners, for the most part, are doing the great evil in the world, right? What I see often, and most often probably, or more often at least, is that this struggle between our earthly life and heavenly life. And so often it seems to me that we opt for, and I don't even think consciously, but we opt for the earthly life, for earthly values. And in one sense, it's to be expected. We begin earthly, right? That's who we are to start with, so to speak. But in many ways, we seem not to be progressing. And I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll lead up to the biggest example I want. We saw a movie the other night down here in McChrystal Hall about St. Francis. And the title of the movie is Sign of Contradiction. But when I look at the way most people relate to Francis or use Francis, it seems that we've domesticated him in a way that makes him comfortable for us. People use him as kind of a patron saint of environmentalism or something. Or they think of him, he loves loved animals, that kind of thing. What was really nice about the movie is it really got to the heart of who Francis was, of turning away from all the possibilities he could have had in this world in order to give himself to God. And he lost a great amount first, but became someone who we identify with Jesus, really. He talked about his life of penitence and spent a fair amount of time on an incident that no one in any kind of popular culture even thinks about with Francis. Is this moment when he decided to push past his revulsion of lepers, and he embraced and kissed a leper. And in many ways, what I love about that movie, I was thinking as I watched it, finally, here's a Francis that bears some relation to reality and not just a Francis that lets us live our earthly life the way we like to. This is a Francis that's calling us beyond, right? Here's another little example. I have to be careful, I guess, of this, but I don't mean anything negative or anything. I'm not making fun of anyone or putting anyone down. But For the first few years I was here, the pastor I heard about most was Father Neiman, the pastor. And people would talk about Father Neiman. Suddenly, I started noticing something, and then I started paying attention. And I'm not kidding here. There are only two things that have ever been said to me about Father Neiman. And they're epitomized in this conversation I finally had with this one woman who is deceased now, who really loved Father Neiman, I guess. I'm sorry, three things about it. One was that he told a joke before each homily. Two, that he took you guys to Canada or wherever that camp was, you know. And three, that he had wine and cheese parties. And I remember this conversation I had with this woman, and she went on, okay, well, what did you like about Father Neiman? And so she said these three things. Then she stopped and looked at me expectantly. You know how that goes, and now I'm supposed to say something, right? And I just looked at her. I didn't say anything, and she's like, well, what? I said, honestly, am I supposed to be inspired by that as a pastor? God forbid, if when I die, if you guys are still around, and all you say about me is that I love nature, wore sandals or something, I'll cry from wherever I am, you know. Now, I don't know whether the fault was Father Neiman's or the fault was the people who talk about him. I don't know. Or fault. Maybe I shouldn't use that word, but if all you remember about me are things like that, I have not been a good pastor. I've not been a good priest. And I've got a long way to go. When I think about St. Francis, I think, how could I make progress like he made or be inspiring like he was inspiring, you know? But here's the third thing. I have to be a little careful about this, and I said something to the family. It's just coincidence we had a funeral yesterday. I had this homily in mind anyway, but it has something to do with eulogy, so I don't want you to think I'm just talking about the eulogy I heard yesterday, okay? But I've been listening to eulogies for a long time, and what strikes me about them is how seldom I hear anything about God in the talk about a person's life. And how in the eulogies, even in the ones that do speak about God, how little place that gets. I mean, you've heard as many eulogies as I have. You know what I'm talking about. You know, well, he loved his family. You know, she loved having her grandchildren over. She was a good cook. Or he loved nothing more. This is what I heard one time. He loved nothing more than sitting on the beach with a beer in his hand, talking to his friends. And I heard that, and I thought, and again, I'm not making fun of anyone, but I thought, his poor wife and children. If that was most important to him, really, you know. Now, whether it was or not, I don't know. That's what someone gathered from this person's life, which tells me he must have spent some significant amount of time sitting on the beach with a beer, you know, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But think about this. If Jesus were sitting out there and the eulogist up there, he loved nothing more for his family. He lived for his family. Jesus would say, so what? Even sinners do that. Even pagans do that. And it would shock us to hear, so what? But in fact, that's what Jesus is saying. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. We begin as earthly people, but we're not called to be earthly people. We're called to be heavenly people. The preface I'll use today, here's part of it. For as by his birth he brought renewal to humanity's fallen state. So wherever we start from was not sufficient. Something had to be done to fix us first. And it goes on, by his rising from the dead, he has opened the way to eternal life. By ascending to you, O Father, he has unlocked the gates of heaven. There's a trajectory that should be in our lives, heading away from the earthly and to the heavenly. And what bothers me about what I hear in eulogies over and over again, I'm not saying people are giving bad eulogies. I worry about the values that we have and hold and live about what you guys hear. I have no control over what you hear on the radio or on TV or in your houses at your parties or whatever. But I do have some control, or I should have, be mindful about what you hear in this room. And over again, what you hear in this room when it comes to people talking about other people's lives as they look back over it are very earthly things. And I worry that that's, in some unconscious, subtle way, that's the idea that you get of this is a good life. Here's another one I heard once. He worked hard to give us a better life. And then the person went on to talk about the education, that they were able to go to college, and I think he started his own business or something also, you know. And again, there's nothing wrong with those things, but is this his definition of a better life? We're 70 years here, 80 for those who are strong, the psalm says, and then everlasting after that. If a better life here has forgotten about God, that's not a better life. It's just a more affluent life. It's just a more educated life or a more comfortable life. Please, you parents, work hard not just to provide economic security for your children. Work hard to give them truly a better life, a life that's filled with the virtues, a life that cares about other people, a life that brings them to eternal life in heaven. One of the things that struck me about the movie last night, or Friday night, where he says some 5 or 6 million people every year still come to Assisi. Francis has been dead for 800 years, and 5 or 6 million people are still coming to where he lived every year. Why? What are they looking for? Why are they coming there to find it? Francis is inspiring, literally, by the mathematical calculation there. Probably billions of people, trillions, I don't know. We can be that inspiring, but no one's going to be inspired by an earthly life. I mean, we might be inspired a little bit by this or that, or, you know, but an inspiration that'll catch hold of our whole lives, there's got to be something beyond earth that does that. And I wonder sometimes, why aren't people flocking into the Catholic Church? And reminiscent of G.K. Chesterton, you know, I think to myself, I guess I'm the reason they're not flocking into the Catholic Church. If I were like Francis, we wouldn't be able to fit people in here. And so yes, we are earthly people, but clearly we're called to things and values other than earthly. Remember last weekend in the gospel, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who are persecuted, blessed are those who are lonely and forgotten. Those aren't earthly values. And so I just felt like the eulogies are just an example. They're kind of an insight maybe, or a window into what we think of as valuable. Now, whether it's what the eulogist thinks is valuable or whether it's what the person being eulogized thought was valuable, I'm not completely sure. I knew Father Neiman a little bit, and I knew he was more than those three things that have been told to me. But perhaps if we lived an inspiring heavenly life, our eulogist would recognize that and talk about that. I was thinking of this, when I was in high school, occasionally in a class, they would have you give you an assignment of write 3 words you want on your headstone or something like that. I was thinking today, what if we went home and wrote our eulogies? Would they be the same as what someone else would write about us? Would they be filled with earthly things, or would they be filled with heavenly things? We may not be Francis, but we can be inspiring. But to truly inspire the world, we have to begin to live, obviously, heavenly lives, which means we live by gospel values, which are very uncomfortable, often, and not earthly values.